Today I'm going to show you what's inside of the Audi 3.2 FSI V6 engine and how it works. First off, I want to thank you guys for hitting 300,000 subscribers on this channel. Now this engine is out of a 2005 Audi A4. Now the 3.2 V6 was one of the first engines to have direct injection for its time. Now we're going to tear down this engine to see what makes it different from a lot of normal V6 engines. So we're going to start by taking a quick look around the engine here. You've got 3 cylinders on this side and 3 cylinders on that side, forming a V shape with the intake plenum in the middle. We've got this drive-by-wire throttle body here. Now perhaps the most interesting or stupid thing about this engine is the fact that the timing side of the engine is on the back side of the engine. So this is the side that would connect to the transmission, and it sits longitudinally in the vehicle. So anytime you'd have to do any timing work on this engine, you pretty much have to remove the engine from the transmission or perhaps take the whole thing out of the vehicle. Now coming around to the side of the engine here, you can see that we've got the exhaust manifold followed by the engine mount on this side because it's mounted longitudinally. We've got a vacuum pump at the front here, and then we've got these coolant hoses that come on with the block and the head respectively. Then at the front here we've got our accessory drive with our crank, our water pump, and your alternator and AC compressor would be over on this side. Now I have no idea why this engine is here, or it may have failed, so the first thing we're going to do is just pull out the spark plugs. Oh my goodness, there's so much oil in there. Okay, I got a piece of my brother's old dress shirt here. Just wipe that off. Something tells me this is going to be a really dirty video. Okay, that plug looks okay. Jeez, this plug is completely coated in oil. Guessing this engine's been burning and leaking a lot of oil. And here's the 3 spark plugs on the other side. I'm just going to go ahead and remove all this wiring harness from around the engine. And I can remove this giant engine harness. Alright, next I'm going to try to get off this air intake. Got a couple of T30s. I'll lift this up. Now with the air intake plenum removed, you can see it clears up a lot of space in the middle of the V of this engine. You can see we've got the lower intake plenum part over here, which are plastic runners that'll still run down to the engine head. Over here we've also got the PCV lines that are going to come off and feed this ventilation hose that goes over to the valve cover, and this other ventilation hose that connected back up to the air intake in order to refeed that back down into the system for emissions. Now what was so unique about this engine is the direct injection system. You can see that low pressure fuel is going to come in from the tank through this hose over here. It'll then come down over here where it'll get pressurized by the high pressure fuel pump, and then sent off through this line where it splits off to this bank over here, which has its fuel rail and the 3 fuel injectors where you can see these wires here lead up to underneath, and then it'll split off to this side over here where this fuel rail, where it's got 3 more injectors over here to directly inject gasoline down inside of the engine. Now directly injecting gasoline at such high pressures is going to lead not only to better fuel economy and more power, but it's also going to be better for emissions. It's definitely got a lot of oil in it. So next up I'm going to work on removing this piece of the intake plenum, which has the fuel rail on it. Now, there's one thing I don't like about Volkswagen Audi. In order to remove this fuel rail and air intake assembly, you have to remove this fuel line, and this fuel line is held on by Torx screws. Now you've also got to remove these Torx screws here, as well as a 10mm nut, but in order to remove the fuel rail, of course, you're going to have to use a wrench to get the rail off over here. But in order to remove that, to get enough access in here, you got to remove this engine bracket. Just to get one part off, you got to use 2 different tools. This bolt over here is an M8 triple square, which is a 1/4 inch drive, and then you got an M10 triple square over here and here, which is a 3/8 drive. So now we've got to get not only different sockets, but also different ratchets, or an adapter like this one. It really makes the technician's life a lot harder when you got to keep changing tools all the time. Now I can remove the fuel lines. Alright, so just pry up on this intake here and lift it off of the injectors. And here's what that lower intake plenum looks like. See, you've got the fuel rail along the bottom here, as well as the O-rings that feed the individual injectors, which are actually located directly on the head because it's direct injection. This one also has the air induction system, where it's got a vacuum driven diaphragm here, which is going to push up and down in order to open and close the valves inside of here. There we are. I'm going to carefully use my electrical connector removal tool here to remove these wires from the harness. That way we don't damage the harness. So I've gone ahead and disconnected this PCV hose that was connected to both valve covers over here and connected down over here to ventilate the crankcase. Next we're taking a look at the cooling system on this 3.2 engine. Now at the front here you have this water pump, which is going to drive the coolant flow in this engine. Over here on this side you've got your coolant hookup from your radiator, and then there's also this crossover pipe that's going to cross coolant over from this head over to this head and then back out to the upper radiator hose. There's also a split that goes down to the oil cooler, as well as one at the back here that goes back to the heater core. Now at the top here you have your thermostat housing. Interesting placement for a thermostat underneath that big air intake. Probably have to do a lot of work just to do a thermostat on one of these. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this pipe, the thermostat, and then the water pump. More mess. Now we can remove this line here. Remove a couple of M10 fasteners here from the water pump. Okay, I got it, but it was off camera. Alright, bunch of T30s holding the water pump on. Well, some Audis had a plastic impeller. At least this one's been upgraded to the metal one. Next I'm going to tackle the thermostat housing. Audi makes so many random brackets. It just makes it so difficult to keep track of everything. Made of plastic. So just like any other cooling system, you've got the water pump, which is bringing in coolant from the radiator. Is then going to send it out to the thermostat. And if the thermostat decides that it should be open, it'll then send it through the engine block and the engine heads to cool things down. If not, it's just going to route it back through this bypass over here where it's going to get recirculated again. Interesting thing is the thermostat housing resembles the same thing that the water pump resembles. Now I can remove the hose that goes to the back of the heater cord. This is a good time to retrieve all those extra hardwares and 10mm sockets that you might have lost down in this V here. So the next thing I'm going to do is remove all the bolts holding the valve cover on. This is the passenger side. Alright, I'm going to pry this up here. Pull off this valve cover. And this valve cover is pretty light. It is made of plastic. And we do have a valve cover gasket over here. Valve cover design is pretty straightforward. Just got one air inlet for the PCV here with the baffle system inside of here. Now taking a look under the passenger valve cover here, you can see we've got a double overhead cam design. These are all fed by the timing chain system over on the back of the engine. Now there's a single cam profile for each valve because there's actually 4 valves per cylinder. We've got our intake side on this side and our exhaust camshaft over on this side with the respective reluctor wheels that are going to be picked up by the camshaft sensors respectively. And in addition, the exhaust camshaft over on this side is going to feed this vacuum pump, which is going to feed things like your brake booster or any other vacuum powered devices. I'm going to remove the driver's side valve cover. Jeez, this one's been resealed. You can see the paste that they've put on it. You see things are the same. You've got a double overhead cam design with the intake on this side and the exhaust over on this side. Although I do notice it's a little bit more tarnished under here. This is the side with the oil cap. The only difference is the intake side on this side drives the direct injection pump. I'm going to remove this direct injection pump. You can see the camshaft is going to be pressing down on this, which is going to create a back and forth action, which is going to pressurize the fuel. It's almost like a little camshaft bucket here. Next I'm going to remove this vacuum pump. The slot is going to slot into this camshaft here and rotate, and you can hear that's going to drive the pump on the inside. Next I'm going to focus on the front here, so we're going to remove this inlet here for the water pump thermostat assembly. Remove that inlet. Now this idler pulley's got a little hubcap that you pop off. Alright, now I gotta get this pulley off. Got all the bolts out of it. Oh my, just made a huge mess on the ground. I'm gonna need a lot of shirts for this one. My wife's gonna kill me for this mess. Okay, I'm gonna remove the front seal on this. But I don't get why you have to use a screw this long just to hold in a thin piece of metal. And here we come to the balance shaft assembly. Now before I move to the back of the engine and the timing components, I'm going to remove the 2 manifolds. Underneath here there's a couple other things I want to remove, including this engine mount and its bracket, as well as the brackets up here for the alternator and AC compressor, and the oil cooler down below. And this Audi actually uses an electronically adjustable engine mount. You guys ever try this? 1/2 inch to 3/8, 3/8 to 1/4, and then a small little socket on the end. Alright, now I want to remove this oil cooler. That's how oil and coolant mix. And that's pretty much what the oil cooler looks like. It's basically a small heat exchanger where coolant comes in here and then oil comes in and out here and they exchange heat. So now that I've stripped off as much as I could from the top, the front and the sides of the engine, it's time to tackle the elephant in the room, the timing chains at the back. And over here on the passenger side, I'm going to remove all the T30s holding this timing cover on. These bolts are so loose, no wonder this cover is leaking. And taking a look inside of here, you can see we've got the intake and exhaust camshafts driven off of this timing chain over here that loops around and goes down inside of this cover. You got a hydraulic tensioner located inside of here that presses against this slide here, and it's oil galley. And you've got the main oil galley, which is going to feed the rest of the head components up at the top there. Now both of these get filled up with oil using these 2 oil control valves over here for variable valve timing on both the intake and the exhaust side. Now at the top here you've got your oil filter, which is nice because it's easy to access right on top of the engine when you want to do oil changes. And in order to take off this plastic oil filter housing, we have 2 M8 triple square sockets here, and then also a 10mm hex socket over here. So that's just Audi trying to ruin the technician's experience by having to change tools to remove the same part. From the block, You can see it's also got its oil pressure switch over here. And lastly, I'm going to remove the timing cover for the driver's side. Looks like a small oil pan. So once again, same thing on this side, oil control valve over here and here for two variable valve timing on the intake and the exhaust side. You've also got your tensioner located over here, which presses against this slide, and then just a regular timing chain slide over here. Now, one of the stupidest things with this design, not only if you have to work on the timing, but let's say you want to work on an engine stand like this, you can't really take apart this engine, because if I want to access the head bolts to get the head off, well, I'm going to need to take the camshafts off. In order to take the camshafts off, well, I got to take the timing chain off. But to take the timing chain off, you got to take the front timing cover off. But to take the front timing cover off, I got to remove it from the engine stand, which means that when all this is off, this whole block is just sitting on the ground, and then it won't have enough force to turn those head bolts to loosen them up, unless if the whole engine just falls over on the ground. Now I'm going to try to cheat and see if I can zip off these two bolts here and get these cams to loosen off of that timing chain. That way I can get the heads off while it's still on the engine stand. Triple Torx M14, let's go. I'm gonna change my battery. Alright, new battery, let's go. So the breaker bar is getting it. Now that these bolts are loose, I'm going to remove the top half of this valve cover. It's actually split into two different pieces. A couple of bolts here and all the cam cap bolts. And with the engine still connected to the timing chain, let's see if I can pry this off here. And now I can remove the camshaft itself. So here's the timing chain that goes down to the counter shaft at the bottom here. So we'll just leave that in place. And hopefully we can just slide the whole head up. So it's probably a T53. So I'm just using a T50 socket. I'm going to zip these off. First, it's already starting to make a mess. Okay, I'm going to see if these timing chain tensioners are going to bother me. Okay, I think I'll come back tomorrow and deal with this chain. Alright, passenger side head. Alright, so it's a new day. I've got both the engine heads off, so we're left with just the bare block and the upper oil pan. Now before I flip it over, I'm going to remove this cover for the positive crankcase ventilation system, as well as these two knock sensors. There's one in each bank. Remove all these bolts. And I'll just pop off this cover here. And you can see you've got the baffles inside of here, where the oily air is going to travel in here and get trapped, where the oil is going to come back down. But the air is the only thing that's going to escape through the PCV hose. Now I'm going to be turning the engine over and making a big mess. We got quite a mess here, so I just stole my wife's old track pants. So we're going to wipe this up. Track pants are pretty good because they absorb fluids very well. Now I like the fact that they've used an aluminum oil pan at the bottom here. It's got these fins to aid with cooling. Now there's a bunch of 10mm bolts that I'm going to remove around here. The drain port is located over here for oil changes, and there's also an oil level sensor at the top here. And then here's what that oil sensor looks like. And here's what that oil pan looks like inside. I don't see any sludgy deposits or anything in here. Underneath here you can see that there's these plastic baffles to prevent the oil from sloshing around and to kind of direct it to the oil pickup tube located over here. On this side here we have the oil pump. So I'm going to go ahead and remove all these Torx bolts that hold the baffle on. Now the oil pump has 3 M10 triple square bolts. Just pop that oil pump unit off. Remove the baffle. Now the upper oil pan has got a bunch of 10mm bolts that holds it to the block. The challenge here is the timing cover is on the back here, and I've already removed those bolts before putting this on the engine stand, so I'm going to see if I can kind of lift up on this upper oil pan to get it off. So here's what we got with the upper oil pan removed. We can see we've got the crankshaft here with the connecting rod caps. Once again, these are going to be an E-Torx, so I got to change tools again. And at the back here you can kind of see the timing chain, so I'm going to see if I can pop the pistons out and then deal with the timing. These are an E12 external Torx. At least the rod bearings look pretty healthy and they haven't been spun or overheated. And I think that sideways plate is actually normal. Now all of the pistons looked okay when I pulled them out, and the rings look intact, although there's a lot of black stuff at the top. So now that all the pistons are out, I'm going to take the opportunity while it's still on the stand to remove all the main bearing bolts over here, as well as all of these bolts holding the upper oil pan together, because this is another aluminum piece that bolts over the block to encase the main bearings. Once again, I will have to change tools because this is a 12-point socket, and then these ones are also triple squares going all the way around. To switch down to an M8 for these two little bolts. So annoying. These are 12-point 10mm sockets. That's as much as I can disassemble from the bottom half of the engine without getting to the timing components. Here we've got the engine off the stand, and we've got the timing cover facing the top here. I've removed all the timing cover bolts. I'm just going to go ahead and start prying this timing cover off. Well, what an absolute mess under the timing chain cover of the Audi 3.2 liter V6 engine. This is overly complicated, especially for just a simple V6 engine. It shouldn't really have to be like this. Now anyways, taking a look under here, this is the bottom of the engine. You got your crankshaft over here, then you got these two counter shafts over here, which are going to take these respective chains up to the actual camshafts, which I've taken off from the head over here and the head up at the top here. And you can see there's one chain that powers all of that from the crankshaft. It goes under here, it passes this tensioner. You've got one slide over here, goes around here, another slide over here, goes around here, and then a final slide over here, and that's one timing chain set. Now on top of all of that, we've got a balance shaft located in the middle of the engine here, which also comes with the oil pump drive. So the oil pump is actually going to be powered off of a shaft that goes under here to the sump. Now you can see this has also got one giant slide here encased in this piece of plastic, and it's also driven off of a separate sprocket on the crankshaft. I can already see myself changing sockets multiple times to take this apart. I can see we've got our standard Torx all the way around here. We've got a small triple square holding these slides on, then a bigger triple square holding this on, then another hex holding this on, and an even bigger triple square for the oil pump drive. You can even see they didn't even use the same fasteners here. This is a Torx, and that's a big triple square, and these do the same exact thing. There's no extra loading on it. Why did they use so many different fasteners? Remove the chain here. Then I'll remove this tensioner and slide assembly. The tension looks okay here, so I'm going to unbolt this tensioner. Now all the timing chain tensioners on here are hydraulic. You can see there's a hole over here and a hole over here on the block where oil is going to be supplied to always put tension on here, in addition to being spring powered. Start removing all of these chain guides. Now I can release the chain. Alright, so now that all the timing components are off, I can split the block. And we can take off the upper oil pan here, and all of the bearing surfaces here look very well lubricated, and the crankshaft moves nice and free. Just lift that off. So now that we've got the whole engine apart, we're going to take a look at some of the components here. Here we've got the oil pump, which is going to sit at the bottom of the engine. It's got its own integrated pickup tube, which you don't notice any debris inside. It's driven off of this little hex here. It's driven from the timing chain side of the engine over through this shaft over here, and that's going to pump oil up through this hole over here. And inside this oil pump, you can see we've got these two gears here. That's going to provide oil flow and not oil pressure by squeezing it in between these little galleys. Now oil from the pump is then going to travel through this hole and then down through this oil galley to the back of the engine here. At the back of the engine, the oil is going to flow up through the oil filter over here. That filtered oil is then going to run down over here, and you can see it's going to be split off to two sections to go to this head, and then there's another version of it that comes here and splits off to go to two sections of the other side head. It also goes to things like your chain tensioner over here and over here. Now filtered out oil is also going to come up this galley here and come through the middle of the engine over here where it's going to split off. You can see we've got these oil spares over here that's going to lubricate the cylinder walls. It's also going to have T's that are going to come in here to lubricate your main bearings as well as the crankshaft. Now the crankshaft in this engine is actually nice and unique. You've got these two connecting rod bearings that don't really have any support or spacing between them. They kind of just share the same section of this crankshaft over here. You also see that we've got the two gears here for the timing side of the engine, which is actually at the back, which bolts the transmission. They've kind of been friction welded on here. They're not actually removable. Now surprisingly, this is a V6 engine, but they actually use a balanced shaft, and that's because you've got three sets of pistons here that are going to move back and forth, which means that the engine is going to tend to rock sideways like this because there's not an even set of pistons going in this direction. And so you can see at the front of the engine they've added this balance shaft, which has just a one weight on the front part of the engine. There's actually no weights on the inside here, and this shaft is actually removable, and it is powered by the timing chain side of the engine. Now looking at the top of the block, you can see these are the oil feeds to feed the heads, which is going to have your variable valve timing system as well as your chain tensioner. At the top here we've got a big oil trap for the PCV system. Now looking at the cooling system, you've got the water pump sitting here, which is going to push coolant down through the thermostat, which is then going to push coolant down around the cylinders. Now around the cylinders you've got a semi-open deck design, which means that there's some parts here where it's been reinforced and it's not completely open circle around each piston. Of course that allows the pistons to become a little bit more closer, but more importantly it gives you better strength in the block when you want to put power into this motor. I mean, speaking of power, this engine had decent power with about 255 horsepower. For back in the day, about 15 years ago, that was pretty decent, especially being the first direct injected engine. Now taking a look at this piston, you can see we've got our two compression rings, which are the two big ones on top here. which are intact, but if you look at the oil control ring, it's kind of gummed up inside of there. So I reckon that this engine was probably burning a lot of oil because it cannot return oil back through these little holes over here, back down the sides of the pistons on the inside. So we just end up on the top half of the combustion chamber, and that's probably why it's so black too. Moving on to the engine heads here. Now I do mention before that we do have variable valve timing controlled by these solenoids, so those are also oil activated. We've also got these two oil galleys that run along the middle here, and that houses your rocker arm system. Now these are hydraulic lifters, which means that it's going to use hydraulic pressure in order to adjust any slackness between this and the camshaft so you don't get any tapping. It also means that you don't have to do a valve adjustment on it. Now looking at the back half of the head, you can see we've got this structure here which forms part of the timing chain guide, where this chain's going to come up and go over here, and the timing chain tensioner, which is hydraulic. You can see this is going to be its oil feed over here. This engine has a total of like 4 tensioners, because you've got one on this head, one on the other head, one for the oil pump chain, and then one for the main chain. Yeah, and Volkswagen isn't necessarily known for making good chain tensioner. Here's the timing chain tensioner and slide mechanism from the other head. You can see this here is where it's going to put some tension on the chain. Looking at the back here, you can see the pathway for the oil that's going to flow in order to provide tension here. Now taking a look underneath the head here, see that the exhaust valves are nice and clean, but the intake valves do have a little bit of carbon buildup, and they are black. You can see we've got our direct injector over here, which is going to directly spray fuel into the combustion chamber, and of course that's going to give you more power, less pollution. But the problem is carbon buildup. You see how dirty it is inside of there behind those valves? That's because you've got these direct injectors which are going to spray gasoline into the combustion side underneath here, but they're not really spraying it on the back of these valves. As a result, the PCV system and all other evaporation systems and pollution control devices are bringing carbon back into the intake over here, where it's just going to build up in and behind these valves. Now because you've only got direct injection only, the gasoline is going to work well inside the combustion chamber, but it's not going to really clean the behind of this valve. And then after a while, just like this engine, you're going to end up with a lot of carbon buildup inside it. The carbon buildup behind the valves is bad because it's going to disrupt the airflow inside of there and cause your engine to bog down and run really poorly. Obviously get you worse fuel economy and probably burn oil. You can see the carbon buildup is also present over here on the other head. Now the only solution to this is to literally take off the intake on the car and walnut blast this or clean it up every so often in order to keep the car running properly. Well, as you can see, this is definitely one mess of an engine, especially if you do have to do a timing chain job or any sort of job, because there's so much stuff that you have to remove in order to get to this point here. And yet again, you will have to use a lot of different tools to get in here. Now if you are thinking of getting a car with this engine inside, just make sure you understand the complexity of the engine and how it works, and to look out for any of these common problems that it might have. And make sure you follow me on Instagram to find out what the next engine teardown is going to be, and subscribe for more videos just like this one.